October 1943. Bell Aircraft Factory, Niagara Falls, New York. Assembly line rolling. P-63 King Cobras emerged from paint shop wearing Soviet red stars, not American insignia. Soviet Isle. United States Army Air Forces had delivered verdict 2 weeks earlier. Inferior to P-51 Mustang. Not good enough for American pilots. Not worth deploying to Europe or Pacific. 2,397 aircraft, 72% of total production. All rejected. All shipped to USSR via Alaska-Siberia route. America was dumping its failures on allies. Cast-offs with awkward car door cockpit entry. Mid-engine design nobody trusted. Predecessor P-39 era Cobra had been disaster. British refused to fly it. Americans used it reluctantly. Now Bell wanted Soviets to accept thousands more of same problematic design. When first King Cobras arrived Soviet Union, early 1944, veteran pilots laughed. Test pilot Andrei Kotetkov climbed into cockpit for evaluation. Within 3 test flights, he nearly killed program entirely. Flat spin, structural buckling, impossible recovery without bailout. Bell engineers dismissed his concerns. What could Soviet test pilot know that American engineers had not discovered? But Kotetkov demonstrated problem repeatedly, proved it fatal. Bell was forced to listen. Soviet Union was about to become largest buyer of this aircraft. Fatal flaws meant no sale. Modifications began. Center of gravity moved forward. Armor increased. Hard points added. Still, Soviet pilots remained skeptical. American fighter designed for American doctrine. High-altitude operations supporting strategic bombing. What use would that be on Eastern Front, where combat happened at altitudes King Cobra was not optimized for? Lend-Lease agreement added another layer of frustration. According to 1943 terms, P-63s were supposed to be reserved exclusively for operations against Japan and Far East. Keep them east of Ural Mountains. Build up strength for eventual declaration of war against Japan. Meanwhile, Eastern Front was grinding toward brutal conclusion. Soviet pilots flew missions daily against Luftwaffe. They needed every capable fighter they could get. But, officially, King Cobras were reserved for Japan, sitting idle, while pilots died. This decision would create one of war's greatest ironies. American reject would become Soviet legend. Aircraft that could not compete at 25,000 feet would dominate at 10,000 feet. Fighter that failed American doctrine would prove perfect for Soviet reality. And almost nobody would ever know the truth. To understand why USAAF rejected King Cobra so decisively, you need to understand what American fighter doctrine demanded in 1943. Strategic bombing campaign over Europe required long-range escort fighters. Protect B-17 and B-24 bombers at altitudes above 20,000 feet during missions deep into German territory. At those altitudes, P-51 Mustang excelled. Rolls-Royce Merlin engine with 2-stage supercharger delivered exceptional performance where it mattered most for American operations. Range, altitude, endurance. Mustang had it all. P-63, despite being superior to P-39 predecessor in virtually every respect, still could not match Mustang's high-altitude capabilities. King Cobra was powered by Allison V17-1093 engine, produced 1325 horsepower, impressive at low altitudes, but single-stage supercharger meant performance dropped dramatically above 15,000 feet. For escort missions over Germany, that was fatal flaw. American doctrine in 1943 was rigid. Strategic bombing commanded overwhelming priority. 8th Air Force flying daylight raids deep into Germany needed fighters that could go the distance at high altitude. Nothing else mattered. P-63 specifications told the story. Maximum speed 408 mph at 10,000 feet. But at 25,000 feet, where bomber escorts fought, speed dropped to 360 mph. Mustang could hit 449 mph at 25,000 feet. Service ceiling told same story. P-63 could reach 43,000 feet theoretically, but practical combat ceiling was around 38,000 feet. Mustang operated comfortably at 42,000 feet. Range was adequate, 450 miles combat radius with external tanks, but Mustang could reach 750 miles. When your mission was escorting bombers to Berlin and back, that 300-mile difference was life or death. American test pilots at Wright Field delivered brutal assessment. Aircraft is adequate for low-altitude operations, but cannot compete with P-51 in roles essential to current doctrine. Not recommended for European theater operations. USAAF had already committed to Mustang production. Republic was building P-47 Thunderbolts. Lockheed was producing P-38 Lightnings. All three types could operate at altitudes where strategic bombing happened. Army Air Forces did not need another fighter that excelled at low altitude. They needed high-altitude escorts. P-63 did not meet that requirement. But Bell Aircraft had production lines running. Contracts signed. Workers trained. Canceling program meant wasting millions in development costs and production capacity. Solution was elegant. Ship them to Soviets under Lend-Lease. Let Allies deal with aircraft Americans did not want. Soviets were already largest users of P-39 era Cobra. Had received nearly half of 9,500 produced. Mixed reputation. Tricky handling characteristics. Dangerous spin behavior. Unusual mid-engine configuration made experienced pilots nervous. P-63 inherited all those design quirks. Engine sat behind pilot with long drive shaft running under his feet to power propeller. Center of gravity was touchy. Spin characteristics were unpredictable. Bell engineers had designed aircraft to American specifications. They never considered how it might perform under completely different operational conditions. That oversight would prove fortunate for Soviets and fatal for many German pilots. Soviet test pilot Andrei Kochetkov began evaluating King Cobra at test facility near Moscow in January 1944. His job was simple: determine if this American reject was worth accepting. What he discovered nearly killed the deal. During spin testing, standard evaluation procedure, aircraft entered flat spin. Kochetkov tried standard recovery techniques. Nothing worked. Aircraft kept spinning. Structural members started buckling under stress. He had maybe 10 seconds before airframe would fail completely. Kochetkov bailed out at 8,000 feet. Watched King Cobra spin into ground and explode. Second test aircraft, same day. Different pilot. Same result. Flat spin. Impossible recovery. Bailout. Bell representatives present at testing went pale. This was not supposed to happen. American test pilots had never reported such severe spin problems. Kochetkov was furious. Americans were shipping defective aircraft to Soviet Union. Design was fundamentally flawed. Programs should be canceled immediately. But economic realities intervened. Soviet Union desperately needed fighter aircraft. Any fighter aircraft. Luftwaffe had destroyed thousands of Soviet planes during Operation Barbarossa in 1941. VVS, Soviet Air Force, was still rebuilding. 2,397 King Cobras represented massive infusion of combat power. Could not be dismissed because of spin characteristics, no matter how dangerous. Negotiations began. Soviet engineers presented Bell with list of required modifications. Move center of gravity forward. Adjust maximum aft CG position to facilitate spin recovery. Increase armor protection based on Soviet combat experience. Add additional hard points to wings for bombs or extra fuel tanks. Bell engineers initially resisted. Aircraft was already production certified by American standards. Why modify it based on Soviet input? Answer was simple. Soviet Union was paying customer. Modify aircraft or lose the sale. Changes were implemented starting March 1944. New production King Cobras incorporated Soviet modifications. Earlier aircraft were retrofitted before delivery. Results were immediate. Spin characteristics improved dramatically. Not perfect, but manageable. Soviet test pilots gave grudging approval. King Cobras began flowing through Alaska's Siberia ferry route in increasing numbers. American women pilots flew them from Buffalo to Great Falls, Montana. Soviet ferry pilots, many also women, then flew them across Bering Strait to Siberia. From there, aircraft was supposed to go east, toward Manchuria, toward Japan, build up force for eventual Soviet entry into Pacific War. But Eastern Front was consuming aircraft at a terrifying rate. German Luftwaffe was wounded but still dangerous. Every Soviet fighter regiment needed replacements. And those King Cobras sitting in depots east of Urals looked very tempting. Eastern Front had a completely different combat environment than what American planners understood. This difference would transform King Cobra from American reject to Soviet success. Unlike high-altitude strategic bombing campaigns over Germany that USAAF conducted, Soviet air operations happened at dramatically lower altitudes. Most aerial combat on Eastern Front took place below 12,000 feet. Vast majority of dogfights occurred between 6,000 and 10,000 feet. Ground attack missions, bread and butter of Soviet air operations, happened even lower, often at treetop level. These were not escort missions protecting bombers during 8-hour flights deep into enemy territory. These were short, violent, low-altitude battles supporting ground forces, quick missions, high tempo. Multiple sorties per day from forward airfields close to front lines. Geography explained everything. Eastern Front stretched across thousands of miles of relatively flat terrain. Few mountain ranges to cross. No need for high-altitude operations. Soviet bomber doctrine differed fundamentally from American strategic bombing. Soviets emphasized ground attack and close air support. Il-2 Sturmovik was their iconic aircraft, armored ground attack plane that operated at 500 feet. Soviet fighters protected Sturmoviks, fought for air superiority at altitudes where ground support happened. High-altitude performance was irrelevant. At these altitudes, something interesting happened with P-63s that were not supposed to be in West. Despite official records showing only P-39s fighting Germany, reports began filtering back from both Soviet and German sources about King Cobras appearing over Eastern Front. German Stuka pilot Hans Rudel documented in his memoirs encountering American-type aircraft, especially Air Cobras, King Cobras, and Bostons over Courland Pocket in early 1945. German flak units reported shooting down aircraft that did not match P-39 profiles, longer fuselage, different wing shape. Intelligence officers took notice. Soviet pilots who served under legendary ace Alexander Pokrushkin later claimed entire 4th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment secretly converted to P-63s in 1944. Official Soviet records maintained fiction that only P-39s fought Germany. Lend-Lease agreement required King Cobras be reserved for Japan, but war does not respect paperwork. Regiment commanders facing desperate situations made pragmatic decisions. If King Cobras were available and P-39s were not, they used King Cobras. Filed reports claiming P-39 losses. Nobody in Moscow checked serial numbers. Nobody in Moscow checked serial numbers. By late 1944, dozens of King Cobras were operating on Eastern Front, despite official prohibitions. And Soviet pilots who started flying P-63 in combat discovered something Americans had missed entirely. At low altitudes where Soviet combat actually occurred, King Cobra's weakness became its greatest strength. That Allison engine with single-stage supercharger that could not compete above 20,000 feet? At 10,000 feet and below, it was monster. P-63 could hit 408 mph at low altitude, faster than almost anything Luftwaffe could field in that environment. WWII could manage 395 mph at sea level. Bf-109 could reach 398 mph. King Cobra was faster than both. Heavy armor that made American pilots complain about aircraft's weight became lifesaver during ground attack missions. King Cobra featured armored bathtub around cockpit that could shrug off ground fire that would have shredded lighter aircraft. Soviet pilots who had flown notoriously fragile Polikarpov I-16 could not believe how much punishment P-63 could absorb. 20mm cannon hits that would have destroyed I-16 just punched holes in King Cobra's armor plate. And that 37mm M4 cannon firing through propeller hub? Weapon American pilots found awkward and difficult to aim during high-altitude combat? proved devastating against low-altitude targets. Single 37mm tar hit could destroy German fighter. 2 hits would bring down Ju-87 Stuka. 3 hits could cripple Ju-88 bomber. Soviet pilots loved the cannon, called it door knocker. German pilots feared it. P-63 also carried 2 additional 27mm Machwer guns in nose and 2 more in underwing pods. Combined firepower was devastating. 37mm cannon for heavy targets, machine guns for fighters, and soft targets. Soviet ground attack doctrine emphasized destroying targets on first pass. Get in low, hit hard, get out fast. King Cobra's firepower made single-pass kills realistic. Range was adequate for Soviet operations. Combat radius of 450 miles meant P-63 could strike targets deep behind German lines and return to base, more than sufficient for Eastern Front distances. Fuel capacity of 126 gallons internal plus optional wing tanks gave flexibility. Short-range missions could be flown without drop tanks. Long-range strikes added externals. Soviet mechanics discovered P-63 was relatively easy to maintain. Allison engine was simpler than Soviet-built radials. American manufacturing quality meant parts fit properly. Tolerances were tight. Systems worked as designed. Forward airfields on Eastern Front operated in brutal conditions. Mud, snow, dust, temperature extremes from -40 to +40 Celsius. Aircraft needed to function in all conditions. King Cobra proved remarkably robust. Tricycle landing gear was advantage in mud. Nose wheel prevented aircraft from nosing over on soft ground that destroyed tail-wheeled fighters. By spring 1945, multiple Soviet fighter regiments had transitioned to King Cobra, despite official records showing only P-39s. Best Russian aces, pilots like Pokrishkin, who had made names in P-39, saw P-63 as even better platform. More power. Better performance, improved survivability. Reports emerged of P-63s in action at Königsberg, in Poland, during final assault on Berlin. German after-action reports documented King Cobras shot down by both fighters and flak. Evidence of widespread Eastern Front use became overwhelming, even as official Soviet records maintained fiction that only P-39s fought Germany. Then something impossible happened. Aircraft America rejected was proving superior to aircraft Germany fielded. Lieutenant Mikhail Baranov flew his first combat mission in P-63 on March 15, 1945, over Poland. His hands shook, not from fear, from cold. Cockpit heating was inadequate at -30 Celsius. But engine ran perfectly. That mattered more than comfort. Mission was ground attack. Strike German armor concentration in Stettin. 8 King Cobras. 4 L2 Sturmovix under escort. Baranov had flown P-39 for 6 months. 23 missions. 2 confirmed kills. He knew Aerocobra's strengths and weaknesses intimately. P-63 felt similar but different. More power, better acceleration. Heavier controls, but more stable. Formation crossed front lines at 8,000 feet. German flak opened up immediately. Black puffs of 88-meter fire. Baranov jinked left. Tracers arced past his wing. Il-2s descended to attack altitude, 500 feet. King Cobras followed, provided top cover at 2,000 feet. German tanks appeared. Maybe 40 vehicles, Panzer IVs, a few Panthers, moving along road in column. Il-2s attacked first, rockets rippling off wings, explosions walking along road, 3 tanks burning. Then, W-190s appeared. 6 fighters, 1,000 feet above Soviet formation, diving to attack. Baranov broke right, pulled hard into climbing turn. G-forces crushed him into seat. Vision narrowed, but P-63 responded. Power was there. Performance was there. He came out of turn with FW-190 in front of him, 400 yards, closing fast. Baranov put gunsight pipper on German's engine cowling, held it steady, fired. 37 Metem cannon barked. 3 rounds. First missed. Second hit engine. Third punched through cockpit. FW-190 exploded, pieces spinning through air. Baranov's first kill in King Cobra, 45 seconds of combat, single burst. He returned to base with hands still shaking, not from cold, from realization that this American reject was deadlier than anything he had flown before. Other pilots reported similar experiences. King Cobra was simply better than P-39 in every measurable way. Faster, more powerful, better armed, more survivable. By April 1945, Baranov had flown 17 missions in P-63, scored 4 additional kills, all FW-190s, all low-altitude engagements where King Cobra excelled. He survived the war, transitioned to jets in 1947, flew MiG-15 during Korean War, later became test pilot. In interview decades later, Baranov said, P-63 was best American fighter we received, not because it was perfect, because it matched how we fought. That was the secret. American doctrine required high-altitude escort fighter. Soviet doctrine required low-altitude attacker. Same aircraft, different missions, different results. When Soviet Union finally declared war on Japan on August 9, 1945, same day atomic bomb fell on Nagasaki, P-63s that had been officially reserved for this campaign finally saw documented combat. Operation August Storm. Soviet invasion of Manchukuo. Massive air operations across Japanese-held territory in Manchuria, Korea, and Kuril Islands. 17th Fighter Aviation Regiment, 191st Fighter Aviation Division, deployed P-63s for escort missions, close air support, ground attack operations. On August 15, 1945, Day Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender. Lieutenant Miro Nichenko scored King Cobra's first officially recognized air victory. Shot down Nakajima Ki-43, Hayabusa off coast of North Korea. Japanese air opposition was minimal by this point. Japan had few fighters left to contest Soviet air superiority, but P-63s proved their worth in ground attack missions. Heavy firepower and armor protection perfect for strikes against Japanese positions. 888th and 410th Fighter Regiments flew P-63s during amphibious assault on Kuril Islands, provided cover for invasion fleet, ramshackle collection of converted torpedo boats and freighters that needed all air protection they could get. Soviet Navy P-63s operated over Pacific, saw little combat. War ended too quickly for full force of P-63 units to be employed against Japan as originally envisioned. But by this point, it did not matter. King Cobra had already proven itself where it counted. On Eastern Front, in low-altitude environment, where Soviet pilots actually fought. Soviet pilots who survived war carried physical reminders. Baranov lost 3 fingers to frostbite during winter missions. Cockpit heating never worked properly. He flew anyway. Another pilot, Sergeant Ivan Kozlov, took shrapnel through left thigh during ground attack mission near Berlin. 88-meter flak round exploded 50 feet from his aircraft. Fragments punctured fuselage. 1 piece went through his leg. 1 piece went through his leg. Kozlov kept flying, returned to base, landed aircraft, climbed out of cockpit, collapsed from blood loss. He survived. Leg never healed properly, walked with limp rest of his life. Asked if he regretted flying missions, Kozlov said, "Regret not dying? No. Regret pain? Yes. But P-63 brought me home. German flak killed my friend in I-16. Same hit would have destroyed lighter aircraft. That was the cost. Pain, injury, survival. King Cobra's armor saved lives that statistics could not measure." Approximately 300 Soviet pilots died flying P-63s in combat. Number is uncertain. Official records incomplete. Many losses attributed to P-39 to maintain fiction about King Cobra deployment restrictions. But 300 pilots died in aircraft America had rejected, died because aircraft was there, Because it was available. Because war demanded sacrifice regardless of politics. Soviet Air Force analysis after war calculated King Cobra probably saved more lives than it cost. Heavy armor reduced combat losses compared to lighter Soviet-built fighters. Firepower allowed quicker kills, reducing exposure to enemy fire. Mathematics of war are brutal, but numbers suggested P-63 was net positive for Soviet operations, saved more pilots than it killed. By May 9, 1945, Soviet operational units still had 1,148 King Cobras on strength. Massive force that continued flying well after Americans retired their last P-63s in 1946. Soviet Air Force kept P-63 in frontline service until approximately 1950, then transitioned them to training duties. Here another unexpected virtue emerged. King Cobra became primary aircraft for training Soviet pilots to fly jets. Reason was simple. P-63's tricycle landing gear matched configuration of new MiG-15 jet fighters entering service. Every Soviet-built piston fighter used conventional tailwheel landing gear, but P-63 shared nosewheel configuration with jets. Pilots could master landing characteristics on forgiving King Cobra before transitioning to far less forgiving MiG-15. This role extended P-63's service life into early 1950s. Some units kept one or two King Cobras off books as training aids even after officially transitioning to jets. Landing characteristics were so similar that P-63 time was considered valuable preparation for jet operations. Thousands of Soviet jet pilots got their first experience with tricycle landing gear in aircraft America had declared inadequate. NATO eventually gave King Cobra the reporting name Fred, acknowledgement that enough remained operational to warrant tracking and identification. French Air Force also received 114 P-63s after war, deployed them during First Indochina War, flew ground attack missions in combat until 1951, when spare parts shortages forced retirement in favor of Grumman fight Bearcats. But King Cobra's greatest impact was strategic, not tactical. Aircraft proved fundamental truth about military aviation. Aircraft is only as good as doctrine it is designed for. American evaluators looked at King Cobra through lens of strategic bombing doctrine, high altitude, long range, escort missions deep into enemy territory. By those standards, P-51 Mustang was superior. P-63 was rightly rejected. But Soviets fought completely different war. Short range, low altitude, mission supporting ground forces, high-tempo operations from forward airfields, multiple sorties per day in brutal conditions. For that mission profile, King Cobra was nearly perfect. Aircraft that could not compete at 25,000 feet dominated at 10,000 feet. Heavy armor that made it overweight for American missions saved Soviet pilots' lives during ground attack runs. 37mm cannon, that was awkward in high-altitude combat, proved devastating against low-altitude targets. Luftwaffe analysis after war revealed German intelligence never fully understood extent of King Cobra deployment on Eastern Front. Reports mentioned American-type fighters. Few German commanders realized they were facing aircraft specifically optimized for low-altitude combat. German fighter pilots who survived war and were interviewed decades later remembered King Cobras with respect. One former WWII pilot said, "We called them Amerikanische Jäger, American hunters, fast at low altitude, heavily armed, difficult to kill. We learned to avoid them." That testimony reveals the truth. Aircraft America rejected became threat Germany feared. Soviet engineers had initially been ignored by Bell. Their concerns about spin characteristics dismissed, but their input eventually became critical to P-63's development. Challenges they demanded: improved armor, additional hard points, repositioned center of gravity, transformed aircraft into something better suited for actual combat conditions on Eastern Front. This represented unprecedented collaboration between American manufacturers and Soviet operators. Bell engineers learned that Soviet input was not criticism, but valuable operational intelligence. Soviet requirements improved aircraft for its actual use case. That lesson would be forgotten during Cold War. But during World War II, it saved lives. American women ferry pilots flew thousands of King Cobras from Buffalo to Alaska. Many unaware of combat success these rejected aircraft would achieve in Soviet hands. Soviet women ferry pilots then flew them across Siberia to operational units. Remarkable example of women's contributions to aviation history that remained classified for decades. Female pilots on both sides of partnership, flying aircraft men had declared inadequate. Today, P-63 King Cobra never became famous like Mustang or Spitfire. Never earned legendary status of Corsair or Thunderbolt. But its story carries profound implications for understanding military aviation history. Of 3,303 King Cobras produced, 2,397 went to Soviet Union. That is 72.6% of total production. One of highest percentages of any American aircraft type sent to Allied during war. For every King Cobra that flew in American colors, 3 flew with Soviet red stars. Aircraft's success in Soviet service validated design choices that American doctrine could not accommodate. Mid-engine configuration that seemed awkward became acceptable when you understood its benefits. Better weight distribution. Improved ground attack capability, that devastating nose-mounted cannon. Transition role P-63, played in Soviet jet training programs, extended its impact beyond war itself. Thousands of Soviet pilots got their first experience with tricycle landing gear and King Cobras before moving on to MiG-15s and MiG-17s. Lessons learned. Flying Bell's rejected fighter influenced entire generation of Soviet jet pilots during early Cold War. American pilots who encountered Soviet aircraft during Korean War potentially faced pilots whose most recent piston engine experience had been in P-63s. Aircraft that America had declared inadequate, but that had trained the opposition. Modern air forces understand lesson that P-63 taught. Aircraft must match mission. Doctrine must reflect reality. Exports should consider how allies will actually use equipment. United States Air Force now conducts extensive consultations with allied nations before finalizing export fighter specifications. That practice traces roots to harsh lessons learned when Soviet pilots took American reject and proved it was perfect for their war. Russian aviation museums display P-63s today with pride. Plaques describe aircraft as American fighter that served Soviet Union with distinction. Veterans who flew King Cobras are honored, their stories preserved. American aviation museums treat P-63 differently. Display placards typically read, "Export fighter designed for Soviet Union under Lend-Lease," rarely mentioned that aircraft was American design that Americans rejected. National Museum of United States Air Force at Wright-Patterson has single P-63 on display. Small exhibit, little fanfare. Aircraft painted in American markings despite fact that 72% of production went to Soviets. Plaque mentions export to USSR but emphasizes American design and production. Does not mention that Soviet pilots loved aircraft American pilots would not fly. That omission reveals discomfort with truth. America built fighter it did not want, gave it to allies. Allies proved it was exactly what they needed. By time last Soviet P-63s finally retired in early 1950s, they had served longer, flown more combat missions, and influenced more pilots than anyone at Bell Aircraft could have imagined when they watched those first King Cobras rolling off production line wearing Soviet red stars. Americans saw failed fighter. Soviets saw exactly what they needed. That difference in perspective changed everything. Proved that military hardware has no inherent value outside operational context. Demonstrated that export aircraft should be evaluated by recipients' needs, not donors' doctrine. P-63 King Cobra story is forgotten, chapter in aviation history, overshadowed by Mustangs and Spitfires, ignored by historians who focus on American and British achievements. But for Soviet pilots who flew it, for German pilots who faced it, for maintenance crews who kept it flying in brutal conditions, King Cobra was anything but failure. It was aircraft that matched mission, fighter that saved lives, American reject that became Soviet legend.